Have you seen a flawless vintage Seiko for 50 bucks? That's a scam, but it runs deeper than you think. And today, we are doing an exposé on this Japanese scam that has gotten so industrial it is finally cracking into the luxury market. From Frankenwatches that lie about their own engineering to counterfeit Grand Seikos hiding behind a blobby lion logo, here is how the internet's favorite budget watches are lying to your face. Chapter 1. The $50 listing. Picture the listing that reads, Vintage Seiko 5 Automatic 21 Jewels, day date Japan made. $50, free shipping, 4 days from a warehouse outside Mumbai. The buyer isn't a fool. He's read a few guides, knows to check the case back before paying, so he zooms into the photo first. Reference 7009-3040. That checks out. It's a real Seiko caliber from the 70s, an automatic movement the company built by the millions. He pays, waits, and the watch arrives in a padded envelope on a strap that smells like a tire shop, ticking along more or less on time. The seller has close to 500 positive reviews, which is exactly why the buyer didn't think twice. Nobody scamming buyers outright survives 500 transactions with a clean record. And that's the quiet trick sitting underneath this whole trade. The seller isn't lying about shipping, isn't lying about payment, isn't lying about the watch arriving at all. Every review is honest, because every buyer did, in fact, receive a real, ticking, more or less working watch. The rating system was never built to ask whether the watch was what it claimed to be. It only ever asked whether it showed up. Then he posts it in a forum to show it off, and in about 4 replies, the thread turns on him. Someone points out the dial says 21 jewels and quartz in the same breath, a sentence no real Seiko has ever printed, because quartz movements don't carry jewels the way automatics do. Someone else zooms further into his own photo and notices the word Japan isn't printed at all. It's engraved, badly, into plastic that was never built to hold an engraving. The caseback belongs to one Seiko. The dial belongs to a different Seiko, from a different decade, built for a market on the other side of the world. The movement inside might be genuine. It might not be. Even the seller doesn't seem entirely sure, and he's the one who built the thing. This is the part that stops most people cold. It isn't a counterfeit the way a fake handbag is a counterfeit. Nobody stamped a Seiko logo onto a blank movement built by someone pretending to be Seiko. Almost every piece of the buyer's watch passed through a real Seiko factory at some point decades ago, attached to some other watch that no longer exists. Somebody took it apart, combined it with cases, dials, and hands salvaged from other dead watches. Reassembled the pieces into something that runs, something plausible in a 5-second photo, and sold it as one object with one continuous history. Notice the words in that original listing title too, because they weren't random. Vintage. Japan made. Sellers running this trade have learned exactly which words make a buyer stop scrolling, and none of those words are technically false on their own. The parts really are vintage. Some really did pass through Japan at some point. The lie isn't in any single word. It's in the sentence they form together, a sentence built to sound like a documented history when what's actually being sold is a guess dressed up as a fact. And the reaction the buyer got isn't rare. Search Reddit's watch communities, or Watch You Seek, or half a dozen smaller forums, and you'll find the same 3-beat pattern playing out over and over. Excitement about a find, a reply pointing out exactly what's wrong with it, and a slow, slightly embarrassed silence from the original poster once the picture becomes clear. It happens often enough that regulars barely react anymore. They just paste a link to the last thread that ended the same way. Collectors have a name for this. They call it a Frankenwatch. And when it comes from this specific corner of the secondhand trade, wearing this specific signature of mismatch, they call it something blunter. A Mumbai special. The name isn't really an insult aimed at a city. It's shorthand for a supply chain nobody advertises. Decades of scrapped Seiko parts. Dead stock dials that never made it onto a watch before some warehouse closed. Donor movements pulled from cases too far gone to save. All of it assembled into vintage pieces and shipped out by the thousand, most of them landing in the low tens of dollars. Some run beautifully for years. Collectors who've bought a few purely out of curiosity will tell you, without much embarrassment, that some barely run at all, dressed up as history anyway, and sold with total confidence. The term itself was coined by a forum regular years ago, not as a slur against a city, but as shorthand born from repetition. One long-running collector site now carries something like 68 separate threads built around that exact phrase, almost all of them following the identical arc. A new buyer posting excited photos. A handful of replies pointing out the mismatched dial or the sanded-down caseback, and a final message advising the new owner to enjoy it as a cheap beater and never mention it as a collectible again. The community isn't guessing anymore. It has seen this exact shape enough times to recognize it on sight. There's a quiet shift happening underneath, even this, one worth noticing. The original deadstock dials, the genuine factory paper-wrapped parts that started this whole trade decades ago, aren't infinite. Collectors who track this closely have started noticing reproduction dials, made specifically to feed this exact assembly business, replacing the real dead stock as the genuine supply runs thin. Which means the next stage of the Frankenwatch trade won't even need real parts to begin with. It'll just need parts convincing enough, built for a market that already stopped asking hard questions about where any of it came from. And that's worth sitting with for a second. The buyer didn't get robbed, not exactly. He owns a working watch. What he doesn't own is what he paid for. A documented, singular 70s Seiko with one continuous past. He bought a story. The story was the product. The watch was just how it got delivered. Somewhere online, a different buyer describes opening one of these up out of pure curiosity and finding a cheap, generic movement where a genuine Seiko caliber should have been. Engraved with a Seiko reference it never earned. He still wears it anyway. It looks good on a leather strap, he says, and for what he paid, that's enough. He isn't wrong to feel that way. He's just no longer talking about the watch he thought he bought. That word, precision, is what Japan spent 70 years selling the world. This is where the story of who's been quietly borrowing it actually starts. Ever bought something online that turned out to be true and false at the same time? The buyer's $50 mistake is small. Wait until you see how big this trade actually runs. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. That's why I created a complete insider guide to buying watches. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Chapter 2, the reassembly trade. There's a phrase collectors use for the places where this happens. Watch graveyards, bins of movements pulled from pieces too damaged to repair, boxes of dials, still in factory paper, that never got mounted before a shipment got rerouted or a shop shut its doors. Cases with worn crowns and everything else intact. None of it is counterfeit on its own. All of it real, just orphaned. The business model is almost elegant once somebody lays it out for you. Buy dead stock and broken watches by the kilogram. Sort the parts by reference number and era. Reassemble whatever combination produces something sellable. List it as vintage because technically every part is old, which is a very different claim from saying the watch itself has one coherent history. Buyers who've taken these apart describe cleanup jobs done with what looks like a hand sander on the caseback, gaskets never replaced, so a watch marketed as a diver arrives with no actual water resistance left at all. One collector who bought several just to tinker put it plainly. The movements are a crapshoot, the straps are $1 of junk, and whether the caseback ever belonged to that case in the first place is a matter for debate. It's a strange kind of fraud. If fraud is even the right word for something built almost entirely from genuine components. A real Seiko movement inside a real Seiko case, under a dial that was never actually made for that model, isn't quite fake. It also isn't quite real. It sits in a gap the vintage market never built proper language for. That gap is the whole business. I'll be honest, this is the part of the story that still bothers me. Somewhere out there is a seller who could tell you, piece by piece, exactly what's original and what's reproduction. He doesn't, because the ambiguity is the margin. Certainty would cost him customers. An observation worth keeping. The fraud isn't in the parts. It's in the silence around them. Nobody actually lies about a Frankenwatch. They just never mention what they left out. It also explains why almost nobody ends up prosecuted for any of this. Trademark law has a clear answer for a factory stamping a fake Seiko logo onto a movement it built from scratch. It has a much murkier answer for a workshop that buys real, legally acquired Seiko parts at auction and reassembles them into a different configuration than the factory ever intended. No logo was forged. No brand name was misused in a way any court has ever bothered defining as counterfeiting. What's being misrepresented is the history of the object, not its components. And history has never been the kind of thing a trademark office knows how to protect. And to be fair to Seiko itself, this problem isn't the brand's doing, and Seiko has said so directly. In October 2025, the company's corporate arm published a public notice, an unusual move for a watchmaker that rarely comments on secondhand sales at all. It warned customers that sellers were using the Seiko name to imply authorized dealer status, offering counterfeits indistinguishable from genuine watches, and running storefronts that collected payment and shipped nothing at all. It's also worth saying plainly that modifying a Seiko isn't inherently dishonest. There's a large, open, likable community of people who buy an inexpensive Seiko movement on purpose, something like an NH35 or NH36, drop it into an aftermarket case with an aftermarket dial, and build a watch they're proud of. Something they'll tell anyone who asks is a mod. That hobby isn't the scam. The scam is the identical build, sold to somebody who has no idea it's a build at all, priced like a decades-old collectible instead of a weekend project. Because a Frankenwatch doesn't need a criminal mastermind to exist. It just needs a buyer who trusts the word on the dial more than he questions it, and a market too scattered for any single dealer to police. Multiply the buyer's $50 by the volume moving through auction sites in any given week, and this stops looking like fraud from a distance. It looks like a very active, very cheap corner of a hobby everybody already loves, and it isn't limited to Seiko either. The same playbook shows up in brightly colored fake Omegas out of South Korea, jump hour Zodiacs out of Pakistan, repainted Sturmanskys out of Ukraine. Japan's reputation just happens to be the one big enough and specific enough to make this particular version worth building an entire trade around. Would you rather own a cheap Frankenwatch that runs fine or know exactly what you're buying, even at twice the price? That was the cheap end of the market. The expensive end just got its first real scare. Chapter 3. The line nobody thought would move. Start with the middle of the market first, because this is where the fraud gets less romantic and a lot more industrial. The Seiko Presage line, dress watches priced somewhere between $300 and $2,000, has become one of the most heavily counterfeited watch families Seiko makes, not because it's rare, but because it's popular enough to be worth mass-producing fakes of. Amazon's third-party marketplace is where most of them surface, listed 40 to 60% below retail from sellers nobody can verify. Open one up, and the tells are almost always the same. A flat printed dial standing in for Seiko's actual layered, textured finish, and a generic Miyota or unnamed Chinese movement, sitting where a genuine 4R35 or 6R35 caliber should be. In human terms, someone pays $400 expecting a small piece of Japanese watchmaking and receives a print of one instead. Discontinued models create their own version of this pressure. Seiko stopped making the SKX007, a $200 dive watch, back in 2019, replacing it with a newer line built to a lower water resistance rating and a different crown design. The moment production stopped, secondhand prices on the original started climbing, and counterfeit production climbed right alongside it. Buyers now know to treat any brand new SKX007 listing with a fresh serial number as an immediate red flag, since the factory simply isn't making them anymore. The rarer a model becomes through no fault of its own, the more attractive it becomes to copy. Picture one buyer opening the case back on a Presage cocktail time he'd bought secondhand, hoping to see the exhibition window Seiko is known for on that line. Instead of a numbered, decorated automatic caliber, he found a plain, unbranded movement, with none of the finishing the reference is supposed to carry. The dial outside had looked convincing enough in photos, flat where it should have carried depth, but close enough to fool a 5-second scroll. He hadn't overpaid by much. What stayed with him was smaller than the money, the fact that he'd have worn it happily for years without ever knowing if he hadn't taken it apart out of simple curiosity. Then there's the end of the market that was supposed to be untouchable. For years, the received wisdom in watch forums was almost smug about this one. Nobody bothers faking Grand Seiko. The logic was simple. Counterfeiters chase volume, and Grand Seiko doesn't have any. A single reference might sell a couple thousand units worldwide in a year. Compare that to a Rolex Submariner, moving in the hundreds of thousands annually, and the math used to explain itself. Why would anyone engineer a convincing fake for a watch that barely sells enough copies to be worth the effort? That confidence held for a long time. Then it stopped holding. Collectors started posting photos of watches that looked, at a glance, exactly like a Grand Seiko. Same dial layout, same lion medallion on the case back, same model number stamped where it should be. It took a trained eye to catch what was wrong, and once people knew where to look, they kept finding the same tell over and over. The lion. Genuine Grand Seiko casebacks carry a crisp, sharply defined lion emblem. On the fakes, it comes out soft. Collectors describe it, bluntly, as blobby. The movement is still the hard part to copy, and that's not a small mercy. Grand Seiko's higher references run on mechanisms like the spring drive, an unusual piece of engineering blending a mechanical gear train with a quartz-regulated glide motion, something a counterfeiter can't easily reproduce for cheap. Which is exactly why the advice from experienced buyers has gotten so specific. Ask for a photo with the case back off. A seller who'll show you the outside all day but goes quiet the moment you ask about the movement is telling you something without saying a word. What actually changed the math was volume moving in from two directions at once. The pre-owned Grand Seiko market has been growing quickly, and growing markets attract exactly the kind of attention a stagnant one never does. At the same time, marketplaces started carrying unbranded dials stamped with Grand Seiko's actual logo, no license involved, sold openly as parts. A counterfeiter no longer needs the skill to design a Grand Seiko dial from nothing. He just needs to buy one already made and drop it into a case that looks close enough at a glance. In plain terms, a watch worth roughly $1,200 used to be too small a target to bother faking well. Now, the tools to fake it badly are cheap enough that badly is good enough to fool somebody scrolling fast at midnight. There's something almost admirable in what Grand Seiko actually builds, which is exactly why this stings. These are watches largely finished by hand, checked against tolerances most factories don't bother with, priced for buyers who understand precisely what they're paying for, down to the movement inside. That reputation, not the watch itself, is what a soft lion and a borrowed logo are now trying to spend. One collector nearly bought a Grand Seiko quartz model listed several $100s under market, drawn in by a seller with decent feedback and clean photos. What stopped him wasn't a red flag in the listing itself. It was a stranger in a forum thread, a total unknown, asking one question: "Can you post a shot with the back off?" The seller never answered. The listing came down 2 days later. The market has started building its own defenses against exactly this. Higher-end Grand Seiko listings on eBay increasingly route through the platform's own authenticity guarantee, meaning a buyer's payment doesn't send the watch straight to his door. It gets shipped first to an independent authenticator, checked, and only then forwarded on. It's a strange kind of progress, when you think about it. A program that exists purely because Grand Seiko, a watch nobody used to bother faking, now needs the same institutional trust apparatus that Rolex and Patek have relied on for years. The counterfeiters didn't just fake a watch, they forced an entire tier of the market to grow up. It's a small, unglamorous kind of victory, the sort that never makes it into a marketing campaign. Nobody wants to advertise that their watches now need a chaperone, but ask any collector who's watched this shift happen over the last couple of years, and they'll tell you it beats the alternative, which was buyers quietly losing thousands of dollars to a soft lion nobody thought to double-check. Have you ever caught a fake because a total stranger online asked one good question? If counterfeiters can fake the watch, what happens when nobody even needs to, because the label already does the lying for them? Chapter 4. The word that isn't lying. Exactly. Flip over almost any Seiko, and you'll find one of 3 phrases stamped near the edge of the caseback or printed low on the dial. Made in Japan, Moft Japan, or nothing about Japan at all. Most buyers assume these are marketing flourishes, interchangeable, more or less meaningless. They aren't. They're closer to a legal category than a slogan, and almost nobody selling these watches bothers explaining the difference to the person buying one. Moft Japan is the narrower claim. It means the movement, the mechanical heart of the watch, was made in Japan or by a Japanese-owned subsidiary elsewhere. It says nothing about where the case was machined, where the dial was printed, or where the whole thing got screwed together. Made in Japan is a bigger promise, and it comes with an actual threshold behind it. Under the trade agreement Seiko operates within, a product generally needs a meaningful share, roughly 40% of its total manufacturing cost incurred inside Japan, before it can legally carry that label. Clear the number, and Seiko can request a country of origin certificate from the Japanese Chamber of Commerce that lets the words go on the dial. Miss it, and the watch can be functionally identical, built on the same line to the same specification, and still not qualify. So a watch labeled Made in Japan and a nearly identical one without that label can, quite plausibly, be the same watch wearing two different sentences. Same tolerances, same quality control, same factory group. One simply cleared an accounting threshold and the other didn't. To give credit where it's due, Seiko's actual manufacturing culture, the one this whole reputation was built on, is not the problem here. The company's domestic plants are well known among people in the industry for tolerances most competitors don't bother chasing, and that discipline is real whether or not a given dial happens to say Made in Japan. The issue was never the watches. It's what happens once that reputation leaves the factory and enters a marketplace with no obligation to explain the fine print behind it. There's a reason this quietly bothers longtime Seiko collectors more than most admit out loud. It isn't really about the label itself. It's about what it means that even the honest brand plays a version of this game, and that the gap between sounding premium and being premium can come down to bookkeeping instead of craftsmanship. That gap is exactly what third-party resellers have learned to lean on. Japan domestic market versions of a watch, the ones sold only inside Japan and carrying the fuller Made in Japan designation, get imported and resold internationally as rarer, more authentic, somehow more legitimate than the export version of the identical reference sitting one listing over. A buyer will pay a real premium, sometimes $50 or $100 more, for the JDM version of a watch he could buy new from an authorized export dealer for less, without ever learning that the movement, the case, and the specifications underneath are, in most cases, hardware for hardware, the same machine. Walk through what that actually looks like on a listing page. An export market Seiko diver, brand new from an authorized dealer, priced at $200. Scroll a little further, and the identical reference, imported from Japan and carrying the Made in Japan print, lists for $280, marketed as the rare JDM version. $80, in most cases, for 4 words on a dial that describe an accounting outcome rather than a different watch. None of this is illegal. Nobody's forging a case back or swapping a movement to make this trick work. It's something quieter, and in its own way harder to catch. A real distinction, built for customs, paperwork, repackaged and sold to a customer as a mark of superior quality. The label was never technically lying. It just never had to tell the whole truth, and nobody selling it had any reason to volunteer the rest. Collectors trade this knowledge quietly among themselves, usually after somebody posts a question that starts the same way. He'd bought what he thought was the superior version, paid the premium gladly, and only learned the truth months later from a stranger's reply on a forum thread. The same shape of realization that showed up with the buyer's $50 Frankenwatch and the buyer who cracked open his fake presage. Different scam, same moment. The object was fine, and the story around it wasn't. Ask 10 Seiko owners what MOFT Japan actually means, and most will guess. Ask them if they'd pay extra for a JDM model over an identical export model sitting right next to it, and most will say yes, without being able to explain exactly why. Keep that word Japan in your head. We're about to find out what it was actually protecting. Chapter 5. What the scam was actually stealing. Line these 3 stories up, and the shape underneath them stops looking like coincidence. A Mumbai workshop reassembling dead parts into a plausible history. A counterfeit operation learning that a stolen dial file and a soft lion logo can pass for craftsmanship at a scrolling glance. A labeling system, entirely legal, that lets a marketing word imply more than the paperwork behind it actually says. 3 completely different mechanisms, built by 3 completely different people who almost certainly never spoke to each other. 1 identical target. None of them are stealing money from Seiko directly. None of them require a factory, a forged hologram, or a criminal network moving product across borders. What they're actually taking is smaller and harder to insure against. The split second of confidence a buyer feels the moment he reads the word Japan on a dial and stops asking questions. That confidence took Japanese manufacturing decades to earn, built one reliable movement and one honest reputation at a time, and it turns out reputations don't come with a lock built in. Anyone can borrow one. Nobody needs permission, and almost nobody gets caught, because the crime, if it's even fair to call it that, so often lives in what a seller chose not to say rather than anything he actually claimed. And notice what each layer of this actually required from the people running it. The Frankenwatch trade needed nothing but patience and a bin of broken parts. The counterfeit Grand Seikos needed a stolen logo file and a supplier willing to print it. The labeling trick needed nothing at all, just an existing rule left unexplained to the one person it was going to cost money. The sophistication went down at every step, not up, and the profit held steady the whole way through. That's the part that should actually worry a buyer more than any single fake. This doesn't take a criminal genius. It just takes silence, and a reputation good enough that nobody thinks to ask. Every version of this economy sells the exact same thing underneath the surface, and it was never really the watch. It's the feeling of certainty that used to come free with that one word, before enough people learned to sell the feeling without the substance that used to back it up. Strip away the $50 Frankenwatch, the counterfeit Grand Seiko, the JDM markup, and what's left standing is the same single fact each one quietly depended on. Most buyers won't ask the second question. They'll check the first thing that looks official, a caseback reference, a logo, a phrase printed near the edge of a dial, and once that first thing checks out, the questioning stops. The scam was never especially clever. It just correctly bet on where people stop looking. Every fix the industry builds, an authenticator here, a warning notice there, is really just an attempt to move that stopping point a little further down the line, one question at a time. The buyer still has that $50 watch. He doesn't wear it anymore. It sits in a drawer, not because it stopped running, but because every time he looks at it, he remembers exactly how sure he felt clicking buy and how long it took 4 strangers on a forum to take that certainty apart, piece by piece. He posted it in a resale group last year, asking $20 for it. Nobody replied. He never reposted it. He just quietly stopped mentioning that he owns it at all. That's the actual cost sitting underneath this entire economy. Like and subscribe if you want the next one of these before the algorithm quietly decides you don't. And if you've ever owned a watch that turned out to be more complicated than the listing let on, put it in the comments below.